Welcome to Plot Twist Radio, the show where creativity, storytelling, and the unpredictable path of the creative life all collide. I'm your host, Erin Egnatz. Welcome back to Plot Twist Radio, where every story has a turning point and every voice has the power to change everything. Today's guest is someone who proves that it's never too late to rewrite your story. After spending over 2 decades working in social care, supporting vulnerable communities, walking alongside people through some of life's hardest moments, she made a bold and deeply personal pivot into the world of storytelling. And she didn't just become a writer, she became a voice for the unheard. Her work is raw, emotional, and unapologetically human, exploring themes of grief, addiction, trauma, resilience, and connection. Stories that don't just entertain, but heal. In this episode, we talk about the power of lived experience, why writing later in life can actually be your greatest strength, and how Helen is using her nonprofit to give others the chance to tell their own stories, no matter their background. This is a conversation about courage, creativity, and the belief that every single story matters. So settle in because this one might just inspire you to start writing. Helen, hello and welcome to the show.
Hi, Erin. Thanks for having us.
Great to have you. So, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself before we get going?
Yeah, so I'm an author from Northeast England on the coast, not far from Scotland. And I've been writing for about 6 years, Erin. Prior to becoming an author, I worked 20 years in social care. So I worked in social services with adults. I worked in homeless services. I worked with the police in a civilian role, and I did management for a national charity. So very, very different to writing. And then I became a writer and the whole world changed really.
Wow, that sounds like quite the journey. As you said, you spent 20 years in social care. How did that chapter of your life shape who you are today?
Yeah, that's a really good question because a lot of my writing, Erin, is based on my career, both the experience that I had working in the field, frontline and in management, and also the experiences of my own life and people around me and things that we can all experience and that none of us are kind of immune from. So my writing did start later, and sometimes people say, do you wish you'd wrote earlier? Do you wish you'd become an author earlier? I always say no, because my career shaped the characters, stories, plot, and, everything that I write about really is from a lived experience, either as a worker or as a person. So I think it's really shaped my stories and helped me grow as a writer and as a person.
I agree. And I hear that a lot. And it's the same with me as well. I didn't start writing until my late 30s. I don't know if it was that I didn't have it in me or, like you said, it's the lived experiences because it
Mhm.
really shapes, even in fiction, which is what I write, you know, you kind of put your experiences into those stories. And I don't know. I don't know why, but it seems like right at middle age, maybe that's when it really gets going for a lot of the people I've interviewed.
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely that lived experience and just learning from life and mistakes and successes and being able to write a diversity of characters from the people that you've met.
Yes, absolutely. So, what first sparked that transition from the social care into the writing when you realized, okay, now is the time?
Yeah, really, it started when I was fell in love with reading again. Um, and I'd had probably 15 years where I hadn't been able to read consistently because work got in the way and life gets in the way. And I think we don't often give ourselves that priority of doing something for ourselves. So reading was just something I didn't have time for. And a colleague of mine who used to work in the police wrote a book about his kind of experiences. It was fiction, but based on his career. And I was so proud of him. So I was like, I'm going to read Ian's book. Ian Phillips is called. And I read it and I was like, this is brilliant. And it really sparked my love for reading again. And I just couldn't stop reading at any opportunity. I would have a book in my hand, would be going to the gym and I'd have a book, a weekend, I'd be reading and then I'd be reading and just really absorbing stories again. Um, And I would read books and think, I didn't like the way that ended, or I wasn't keen on that character was really good, or I would have done this differently. Um, and I saw a competition to join a playwriting course. So I submitted a piece of writing and I got on this course and I learned loads. And from that, I just thought, well, why not try? I think the only feeling is never trying. So I started writing poetry and I started to get things published. And then I started to write in secret, may I add. I wrote a book, my first book, The Dinner Club, whilst working full time on evenings and weekends, but I didn't really tell anyone. The rest is kind of history. I would say, as soon as that was kind of published, my whole life changed and I've never been able to stop writing since.
That is a excellent story, and I feel the same way. We're like kindred spirits there. Once you start, you can't stop. It's like all these stories just start coming out of you. So you mentioned the dinner club. What inspired that story?
So the Dinner Club is basically about five strangers who've all got a secret, and it's about love and loss and hope and friendship and acceptance. And I've always worked in the social care field, and fun brings people together. Even in the most challenging of times, I think sharing a meal or a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or a snack brings people together. And the people that we used to work with in my career were very traumatized. And sometimes it was just having a cup of tea or offering them some toast that would help to break down barriers. And I think there's something about giving as well and cooking for someone or just giving someone a cup of tea. It can taste like the best thing in the world if someone makes something for you. So I wanted to send us something around that connectivity that we get from a shared experience like food, but I also wanted to write about characters that were diverse and that I knew about. So within there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of humour as well, but there's a lot of emotion and there's subplots of domestic abuse, of homelessness, of failing marriages, of single parenthood, of grief, of terminal illness. But I've done it in a way where I hope it feels relatable to different readers and they learn something and connect with characters. Um, so that was kind of the original, I guess, news for writing the book.
Wow, that is intense, but you're right. These are the kind of things that when readers slip into them, they look at these characters and they relate. I see myself in that person or that situation, and it makes them feel not so much alone. So not only is writing, I think, therapeutic for the author, but it can be for the reader as well.
Absolutely, absolutely right, Erin. And I think with my with my writing, a lot of the things I write about are controversial in a way. I take a risk and write about things that maybe challenge people's thought processes or like you say, give someone a voice who feels unheard or just make someone feel like they're not alone. Um, or learn something new. And I think that's really important. I think we've got a vehicle through writing to be able to almost campaign and advocate for certain topics and certain characters. And I think that's what drives me, writing something where I feel it's important and doing it in a way that hopefully connects people and resonates.
For sure. So, what is your writing process like? Do you come up with an idea and write it out? Do you use like an organizer? Do you outline, or do you kind of just sit down and just see where it takes you?
Well, to be honest, I wish I was organised. I'm a bit of a whirlwind and I tend to get ideas and they become earworms almost and won't go away. So it's very much all or nothing with me. And I write, I kind of hate the thought people write something in a ridiculously short amount of time till I'm burnt out. But it kind of works for me. And I think there's something about once I have an idea and I'm really feeling it, I just can't stop. It's like a therapy almost. And the characters become me, they just become alive and I just want to keep going. But that's not a good way to necessarily write because it ends up with a complete burnout. And I do have a business that I'm a director of, so I have to juggle my time as much as I can, which is really hard. We've all got different pulls and commitments. So I wish I was more organised, but I'm very scattergun. but it does actually work for me. So I think, well, we can't be perfect, but the end result is what's important, no matter how we get there.
Absolutely. So, a lot of your background centers around giving people a voice. How does that or how do you make that translate into your writing? Because that can be difficult. I think that you do a really good job of it. So, I'm curious how you're able to do it because that's something I've never been able to do.
I think it's really hard, and I think that, people say write about what you know, and if you don't know it, research, research, research. So, um, I try and write about things that I know, or things that either are personal experience or also my work history. I've had a lot of knowledge around. So, for example, I'm not in recovery from substance misuse, but I've worked in the field. So one of my books has a heavy theme of addiction. So I've done that from a place of not personal experience, but work experience. And within those types of scenarios, I have sensitivity readers. So I would check with someone that feels the right terminology, or that a character feels representative and feels valid. So that someone might say, well, that isn't exactly the same story that I had, but I get the emotions, I get the way that character behaves. So it can be tricky, but it is really important to me that I write about such topics. So a lot of it is, very much directly linked to my own work and personal experience, but it's not with a dotted line. And I make sure I do that research and make sure I have people who will read all that, trusted readers who will be able to give me tips or if there's anything wrong. So recently I wrote a book about the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s, HIV and AIDS epidemic. And as a straight woman who isn't living with HIV, I needed to get that right. I needed to get that character right. The main character who was a gay man. I needed to get that right. So I had a sensitivity reader and I did a lot of research. So it's hard, but I think it's really important as authors that we put ourselves out there and that we try and cover all different types of characters, but it has to be done right because otherwise it's offensive. It can be really offensive to an audience and to an individual. And that's really important that we don't do that. So it takes a lot of time. But I think it also takes an author to be flexible and to be accommodating and to not think that they know everything because we just don't. And that's where people like to get involved and help, which is fantastic.
Yes. And I think it's great that you outsource that in a way, talk to others that know it because you're right. We don't know. We like to think we know what we're talking about it as we're creating these characters, but we really don't. And in order for it to mesh with our audience, we really have to know what we're talking about. So I love that you do that. So let's kind of pivot over to the right on the tine. Am I saying that right? Right
Yeah.
on the tine? Because I love what you're doing with that. Can you tell us a little bit about how it started?
Thank you. Yeah, Erin. So when I got my publishing contract with Cahill Davis Publishing for the Dinner Club originally, um, I had I was at an age where I was starting to think about, I guess not being able to do everything. I was in my late 30s, and I think there's something about balance that I've always strived to get as a woman, and as a professional. And I just knew that I wouldn't be able to work in my existing role and write, um, because of the nature of the responsibilities I have in my day job. So I thought, how can I combine my experience and love of working with people, in particular marginalized people, and my new love of writing? So I set up a non-profit called Write on the Tide, which is around making creative writing inclusive, accessible, and therapeutic. So I do a number of projects that are specifically targeted to certain groups of people and some that are open to everyone. I do teaching, and I offer support to people who want to be published as well. So, for example, last year I worked in a local women's prison and did therapeutic writing. And at the end of it, we published a book of their thesis. So I'm back in the prison this year working, doing some courses and some therapeutic writing. And I do bits and pieces with charities as well. I teach, which is always free. to people to try and reduce the kind of elitism that can happen in the arts in general. And basically, I do a range of projects where I feel there's a gap, when's a barrier. I've done books with veterans covering 7 decades of conflict and military history. I've done books with women from a deprived community around gender changes and kind of community over the years. I've done a book with people with from substances. So it's anything that I think um, where there is a gap, where people are being heard and represented. Um, and, it's brilliant for the individuals involved, but it brings me joy as well. So I'm able to choose really what I do to a degree, which helps to have the autonomy to fit in with me writing, but also, brings me a lot of joy as well. So it's hard work having your own business, but it's definitely rewarding, seeing that people being able to express themselves and have an opportunity to write creatively.
For someone listening who feels like their story doesn't matter, what would you tell them?
I mean, I think everyone's story matters, and our stories, whether they be our personal narrative and our heritage, it's really important, but also our imaginations are really important. And I think we'll get messages all the time that, it's not for us. If we haven't done A, B, and C, we can't do X, Y, and Z, it's just not for us. And I think we've got to try and break those stereotypes and those molds and break through those barriers. And I feel, I didn't see I was a writer for a long time. My qualifications has nothing to do with creative writing. I'm still a rubbish speller. But, I think actually it's about imagination, it's about, passion to do something. And I think we've all got that opportunity. We've all got to give ourselves a chance and be kind to ourselves and believe in ourselves. And if we don't, someone else will believe in it until we do. But I think our stories are really important. And sometimes something, writing a line, writing something very small, a poem, in my instance, writing a poem turns into having a publishing contract. It does happen to regular people. Well, there is a lot of celebrities, but it does happen to regular people. And even if you write something that's only for you, it's still really important to write it. It's part of your narrative. So I would encourage everyone to write and just to start somewhere, to start writing and see how it goes. Just don't take it too seriously, but enjoy the therapeutic element of it as well.
For sure. Great advice. So let's talk about the publishing process. It is a journey, to say the least. It is a journey. What have you learned about the publishing world that might surprise people?
I think the biggest one is I remember when I got my publishing contract, and my colleagues at the time said, "Oh, are you retiring?" I can't even afford, like a weekly shop. I think people think that there's a lot of money in writing, and there isn't. There is not. Unless you're really big and you're successful, which does happen to people, it's not. It's not an industry where you're going to make any money. And I think that again kind of makes it very difficult for people, Erin. It's another barrier because unless you can afford to work part-time or, you're retired or you've got finances behind you, a lot of people don't have that opportunity because it costs, you don't get paid when you're writing books. You spend hundreds and hundreds of hours creating something and no one's going to give you an hourly wage while you're doing that. And I think once you get your book out there, um, it doesn't stop. And I think there's something again about the arts where people think it's about your profile and raising your profile, but actually we don't expect the cashier in the supermarket to be working for free. We don't expect the Uber driver to not take a fare. So for me, I think the biggest thing is keeping it real with regards to you unlikely to make a living out of it. And you've got to do it for love, not money. If you do make some money, fantastic, but don't believe don't use it as a reason to write because it's so hard. And it's so competitive and there's millions. I think there's something like 3 million books released every year on Amazon alone. It's a massively competitive market and only a tiny percentage of people ever make it. But that shouldn't stop people from writing because we'll write because the story is important, because our voice is important. Anything is a bonus, but I think my biggest sort of shot I would actually, you don't make any money from this. Yeah.
Yes, that was a big shock. I remember the first time, I had the, really successful release, and I was like, "Yes, finally, this is awesome." And, I was ranking kinda high on Amazon, and then when it came for, like, money, I was like, "Oh my god, that doesn't translate into the work I put into it."
Just crazy. The amount of money is absolutely crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little depressing, it's a little disheartening, but it hasn't stopped my love for writing. So I think it's so important that you said that, just keep doing it. Just keep doing it. Maybe you'll be the one that hits it big. Who knows?
Absolutely. Anything is a bonus. And I think sometimes, when someone reads your book, that's priceless. And I remember, I've had so many lovely messages about my books from strangers. And one of the first ones I got was from the Jeanette Courtney's Facebook. And um, a woman said, your book made us go for therapy. And I was like, that's priceless. That is what everything is about. Or someone saying, your book made me feel that I wasn't alone. That character made me feel that I wasn't at risk. That's priceless. So, although you don't get much in the form of money, you get a lot of wealth from people's feedback and from sharing the story. And I think you can't put a price on that.
Very well said. So, what is up next for you? Do you have any upcoming projects or recently released projects?
I do, Erin. So I have a book come out with my publisher in July called Find an Author Widow, and that is about a middle-aged guy who on his mother's deathbed finds out who he thought was his father, isn't his father, and he goes in search for his father. So that's come out in July, and then in the autumn winter, I also write crime police procedural books. I'll be having the third in my police procedural series coming out as well. So two this year.
Wow, very exciting. Where can the listeners find you?
So I'm on Facebook as Helen Aitchison Wright and Instagram, Helen Aitchison Wright. And I also have my websites, helenachesonwrights.com and writeonthetime.com.
Perfect. And I will make sure those are in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Honestly, this is one of those episodes that sticks with you. What I love most in her reminder that writing isn't about perfection, it's about truth. It's about lived experience, about giving voice to the moments and the people that might otherwise go unseen. And maybe the biggest takeaway, you don't have to start early. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to start, whether it's a novel, a poem, or even just a single sentence written for yourself. Your story matters. If you want to learn more about Helen, her books like The Dinner Club, or the incredible work she's doing through her nonprofit to make writing more accessible and therapeutic, be sure to check out the links in the show notes. And if this episode inspired you, even just a little, take that as your sign. Write the thing, say the words, tell the story, because you never know who might need to hear it. Until next time, this is Plot Twist Radio, where the story always changes. And so do we.